All right. So, I wanted to point at something, and that's the pardon me. That's the signature, essentially the felt signature, or the experiential contrast between engagement in the internal world of thoughts and the engagement with the immediate sensory experience, which can also include thought, but here I'm just going to make a distinction between the two. So what's important about this, and when it becomes clear that the world of the mind, the internal narrative and thought, as I relate to the world, me and my story, experience happening to me at the center of my position in the world. When this finally gets tiresome, let's say, when this finally becomes clear that the solution isn't in the analysis, the solution isn't in the conceptual understanding, and there's an attentiveness to thought, there's an awareness of thought that isn't quite present when there's full engagement in the thought world, the internal world. But when there's a slight step back from that, then the attention isn't so much on what's suggested in the narrative of the thought, the content of the thought stories, but the actual sense of thought itself, the actual experience of thinking, of thought. This is why I think awakening's a good descriptive term. There's a sense of coming out of a dreamlike state. There's a sense of expansiveness, a sense of slowing down, of stepping out of release, of relaxation, that all comes from simply noticing the experience of thought rather than being engaged in what is suggested in the narrative, in the content. This seems to bring us back to our immediate sensory experience. So this physical sense of being here, of existing as this. Let's say initially in a body, the body sense, the sense of the world, the sense of the appearance visually, the sounds, the textures, the touch, the contact. This can be a very good anchor point to bring attention back to the immediate. And this is what is meant when you hear talked about direct experience. Initially, it might be beneficial to avoid, or at a certain point I found it beneficial to avoid the thought. I say avoid the thought, that's a bad way to put it, but have the attention rest on the physical, immediate sensory experience, because the thoughts can be very enticing, and it can easily become carried away into an engagement with the narrative. So having an anchor point in the physical experience can be beneficial, and that presence there can give way to an attentiveness and a noticing when thought does arise or appear. There's a very distinct experiential difference in quality of, you'll notice this yourself, when you're engaged in thought, it's very contained, it's very closed, it's very limited. It dulls the senses. It's apparently some people feel it's like a step back, a separation from experience. For me, it felt like a moving down and into a closed internal world. And then all of a sudden, who knows why, there's a noticing that I'm lost in thought. And that very recognition, the attentiveness to thought, noticing that what's happening, noticing that we might be lost in a time narrative about a story about my life and how I relate to the world. Just the simple noticing of that seems to stop this momentum of the mind and bring us back to this immediate sense of being, this immediate sense of presence. People call it awareness. There's just the sense of existence, the sense of just here-ness and simplicity. That's what I'm always pointing to. This pattern, someone mentioned in the comments that this happens automatically, that yes, it's like a repetitive pattern that has accumulated momentum. The thoughts appear, and it might be easy, depending on the time, it might be easy to stay attentive and watch a thought appear. What will be the next thought? This thought appears, and recognize it as such. That's a thought, without thinking about it or going into another narrative about how you relate to the thought as the character who relates to it. But simply noticing that for a period of time, let's say, it stops. It all dies down. And what's here in the absence of that to the mind seems too simple to be enticing. Not interesting enough to accept as enlightenment or awakening or whatever the objective of the mind is as it relates to this process. But that's it. That simple recognition that I'm lost in thought. Noticing of that, and then that's like a disidentification. That simple recognition is a disidentification from that, the reality, the suggested realness, or suggestion that this is the primary experience of how I experience myself, this rolling thought narrative that talks about this and that. And the quality of that, when we notice that, is expansive, it's still, it's simple, it's present, all-encompassing. This is the awakening. This is the recognition I always talk about. But what changes fundamentally, let's say in the relative timeline after a certain point, is that noticed contrast, let's say, that clear contrast between being fully engaged in that internal world of thought, the thought coming up, and maybe we notice it a few times and then we grip onto it unconsciously, and then before we know we're in it, and then before you know, you this recognition hits again, and you realise, I'm lost in thought again. What changes is the one that notices that, the one that relates to that experience is, yes, there was this experience of expansion and presence, and then there was this experience of being lost in thought. You see how that's a time thing? You see how that's a relational thing from a point of view? In the actual recognition, in the moment of, let's say, the moment of recognition that I was lost in thought, before the explanation about it, that doesn't occur in the past or future. It doesn't occur in relation to the one who experiences it. It just happens, let's say. It just is. And it's falling deeper and deeper into that immediacy, into that lack of contextualizing in a timeline, lack of relational value from a position. As in, who is the one that's noticing this and contextualizing it into as this relates to me in the timeline? The very fundamental suggestion. What is suggested in the context of all of these thought narratives is that there's a me here that relates to all this. I am thinking. I am noticing myself become more present. I'm having a recognition. I was lost in thought. That very fundamental suggestion that there is a me here that all this experience belongs to, and I'm trying to adjust it so that it's more suitable. That itself is a very, very subtle thought. Very, very subtle suggestion. It's more of a feeling, an energetic thing. So what's important is, when I'm using a lot of words here, it's not about the concepts, as I say many times. What's more important is the felt intuitive sense of that contrast, that distinction and experience between noticing the thought narrative, noticing a thought, and then it dissolving, and then the experience becoming unqualified by a relational character, unqualified by comparison on a linear timeline, unqualified by anything. That space becomes, in a way, threatening to that mind identity, because it's the unknown. There's nothing in it. It's uninteresting, and it's actually a bit scary because there's nothing there for the self. The self almost has to be forgotten about. The story that suggests it almost has to be forgotten about in that instant, which doesn't exist in time, such that something that's not a thing, some fundamental aliveness, fundamental existence, presence, isness, I amness, whatever, many names you could call it, but none of it quite, they all miss the mark. Whatever that is, the essential essence of what you are, what I am, what we are, has the chance to let's say be revealed, but it's revealed to itself. It's not revealed to a character central to the experience. That's the very paradoxical and difficult part to point to, and I can only use concepts and words to point to it so far, because it's a felt sense. So for me, I would notice this all unfolded when I was walking. I liked walking, and I would notice that I would be fully engaged in the sensory experience of walking, initially as the character moving through a world, a body moving through a world, but as I dropped deeper and deeper into the senses and I was attentive to the movement of mind as it appeared directly in real time, in direct experience, I noticed that I would be lost in thought and then I would recognition hits come round. Oh, lost in thought. Not that I'm saying this, but lost in thought. And then it became very obvious the difference in quality of experience of that dreamlike engagement, dulling of the senses, the enclosed experience of internal narrative, and the recognition, the expansive experience of relaxing into the senses, relaxing into this unknowable mystery of physical existence, of aware presence, or whatever you want to call it. And then there would be periods where I watched the thoughts. It felt like it was framed at that time. I'd be watching the thoughts come up. The thoughts came up, and then I would again recognize them as a thought. There would be a bit of tension there, a bit of resistance to thoughts. But then there was a noticing that this referential position from which I was based as a centre point that noticed all this stuff, it became clear that was a very subtle form of thought, and it had a feeling to it, it had a charge to it, had an urgency to it, a very subtle need to control experience or figure it out. And when that was noticed as such, as a thought, it was then, let's say, possible to fully relax into the sensory experience without this subtle charge of I'm the one doing it, this subtle charge of I'm doing this for a purpose, or this thought appearing means that I'm not doing well, or the period of mind quietness, and then a thought pops up that says my mind is very quiet. It's ridiculous. And then there was another, almost like another stepping back to the position where it wasn't possible to step back anymore. It wasn't possible to struggle anymore with this. It wasn't possible to hold a position from there, or confirm any part of experience as having a value from there. And there was as that is no position, as that is a full relaxation such that this is no position, but also all positions, any subtle position constructed by thought that appeared was more clear, was more, I guess you could say that the overt mind narrative died down to an extent that the more subtle thoughts became clearer. And as I dropped into this space, this stillness, this fundamental sense of existence or awareness or presence, the senses became more pronounced. The physical experience became, I described it at a point, and a number of you folks on here that are subscribed and watch these videos described it in the same way. The silence started to become louder. The stillness started to become more obvious. And in that stillness, in that silence, let's call it, in that presence, as this awareness, something fascinating about experience became obvious, but not obvious in the way that it needed to be confirmed by thought, or needed to be thought about or referred to as having any sort of value. Very paradoxical, very hard to talk about. And once that was tasted, once that became clear, once existence became clear to itself, not as this this character that's engaged in an internal world, an internal struggle. As once that was tasted, then it was just that all the way. It was just dropping into that all the way, and I would describe it as a relaxation, a relinquishment, a release, rather than an act of doing. Because up until that point, it felt very personal. After a certain point, it felt there was an impersonal quality to it. There was a clear. It was clearly impossible to comprehend this through concepts and thought, and that then became irrelevant. The felt sense of this became much more overt, much more clear than what the mind could possibly say about it. That's the best way I could describe it. I say this to illustrate that this is much more about. It's a different kind of understanding. It's a felt understanding. It's an energetic resonance rather than a psychological or conceptual position. And that's why I always go on about positions. There's a feeling signature to a mind position, to a me position, and it is hidden by this function of belief, by this function of identification. It feels like me. It feels like you. But if you follow that you back, if you follow that me back and think, who believes this? Who is suggested to be doing this? Who's thinking about this? To follow it back and just look, what are the beliefs about this experience right now? What are the thoughts? Do I need to believe any thoughts or believe anything for this to be inherently self-confirmingly obvious? And it's just a deeper and deeper relaxation into this fundamental existence. And then they need to figure it out, they need to explain it. It seems ridiculous to say because I'm always explaining it, but it becomes irrelevant. In fact, in doing this channel, the explaining it caused a lot of confusion at the start. It almost formed a new identity of the one who had an awakening, who had a spiritual experience and talks about it, and that, you know, was like the safe position for the self, for the me. It was like a new reconfigured identity, much more simplistic, much more at ease, but it was still an identity. But then it could be felt, and the emotions, the feeling, as well as the sensory experience, the sensory existence, physical existence of this, the emotions become more apparent. There's a more powerful expression of emotions, a more immediate experience of emotions. And then when the identification has diminished to an extent, when the identified thoughts have diminished, it becomes obvious that those identified thoughts exist, that those positions exist as a defense mechanism for this apparent entity to hide away from what it's averse to in terms of emotions and this physical experience. And then the link between thought and emotion becomes apparent, and thought can almost be untangled from the physical experience of emotion. Eventually I noticed that there was a limits of language. I say I noticed at this point, it was, you couldn't really describe it like that, but the emotions had a narrative to them as well. It was kind of like the emotions were a different version of thought, I could say. Like, it maybe a bad way to put it. Thought had a narrative that was pulling, that was in a way contextualizing something. At that point it gets really hard to talk about, but if there was still trying to figure it out in the sense of thinking about it and believing the explanations about it, that emotional undertow narrative would not have been accessible. So when you notice yourself caught in thought, and that's what I refer to as the recognition. That's the awakening. It's not. It's anytime you notice I'm caught in thought. I'm saying this verbally, but it's that recognition. You're away in a thought narrative, and then you recognize I was lost in a thought stream there. That's the recognition. That's what I'm always talking about. It's not some event in the future. It's that. That's it. And that's it. Just follow that back and see, what does it feel like? From what position does it feel like I'm observing that what just happened there? Because it kicks in very quick. It kicks in very quick and suggests that this is something that's happening to me. Where is the me? What does that feel like? Follow that back. It's very, very subtle. This is the tricky part for people. Because we're doing this spiritual thing as a doer. Do you recognise that you're lost in thought, and then there's that recognition, but very, very quickly there's a position there that says, I was lost in thought, and now I'm still. This is my experience of stillness. This is my experience of no thought. You see how sneaky it is? That context, that relational position is the key. That sense of the me, it's hiding in the context of the mental narrative. At times it talks about itself, I do this, I do that, but then when we really look, it hides in the context. And it, when we get closer and closer to this, closer to noticing it, let's say, bad way of putting it, but noticing it, it becomes more and more subtle. It hides in a spiritual context of, I'm meditating, I'm lost in thought, I haven't been lost in thought for a while, or I'm noticing the thought, I'm noticing the no thought. It just gets more and more subtle until something switches, something does clarify, and it can happen relatively over a time, or it can happen in an instant. But it's always now. Feel that movement away from experience. Feel that movement away from simplicity. Feel that gripping on of the need to figure it out, and then the complexity that comes from the experience of thinking as a me, as the thinker. Just notice that, energetically feel it. And then when you feel it, it's just that all the way. And it just becomes so simple. So simple. So, but frequently this happens all the time. People will ask me, they'll maybe summarize things that are said by myself and other speakers or whatever on YouTube, and they'll say, so it's like this, and is it like this? So it's like this, is it like that? And so on. And that understanding is good, but it very quickly turns into a fixation. What I'm talking about is nothing that can be truly referred to by the words. It can only be felt. And the words here, this pointing, is, as you're watching this, be attentive to the thoughts. What are the thoughts saying? Is there a movement to try and figure this out? Or is this directing attention or awareness towards this immediate experience of presence, this immediate physical sense of existence, sense of aliveness, right here, right now? And what does that feel like? Anyway, I need to go, and I'll talk to you next time. If loads of good comments recently, so if you're inclined to post a comment or a question or something, anything, just pop it in the comments, and then I'll make another response video and post that when I've got the time. Take it easy.